Yeah, my father's a 8th grade science teacher, and they build a lot of projects in their class. And my grandfather is a machinist, and we kind of a garage engineers where we find something in the garage and make it work. And so that's been most of my experience with that, I would say. My first career was in wood manufacturing. I had done a degree in wood products manufacturing technology and then got a job working in a furniture factory. I did that for a little bit, went back to school, and from there got a job teaching sustainable energy. So in that they said, well, we need people to work on wind generators, wind turbines. And they wanted me to figure out how to do it, so I got a job doing it and learned what I could and started teaching that, training future wind technicians. Well, I happened to be at a conference where Eastern had a job posted for an energy technology faculty, and my brother had gone here actually, so I was kind of interested, and he had said good things, and then I looked at it and got a phone call a few months later and ended up here. So I like to break ropes, figure out why they break, and it supports the energy field because that's where I got my first exposure to it, was climbing wind generators. And if you're going to climb up there and there's a potential for a fire, an arc blast, anything like that, or an injured individual, you have to be able to get them down effectively and quickly, or relatively quickly. And so the exposure to that sort of element and that sort of lifeline, as it were, really was intriguing to me, since I'd done Boy Scouts as a child and been around ropes and knots and all this, and so it spoke to my youth. And both in wind and cell tower work, the ropes were just abused as if they were a chain almost, dragged across the gravel, run over with trucks, tied to what appear to be sharp edges. And when you go through the training on how to use ropes and how to inspect them, how to go through that process, they say, well, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, because we know it hurts ropes, but everybody said, it's fine, nothing's going to happen. And maybe that's the case, but sometimes the lack of an accident is an accident itself. And so I said, well, they keep saying you don't know how much. And I said, well, you quit doing that, don't treat it like that. And they said, well, you don't know how much it's doing it, it's barely a thing. Well, you know what? Let's quantify it. Let's figure it out as best we can. And there are too many factors to do in a laboratory and say we have a definitive answer. So that's never going to occur, but we can at least take that destruction, those individual variables that destroy the rope, and then we can examine the rope afterwards. And we can look at the fiber. We can polarize the light to see where the stresses are internally in that fiber. And they're only 30 micrometers across, most of those. And so in doing that, we can use those images to actually train people and say, here's what you're actually doing to this. You're destroying it, and you're taking bits and pieces, and you're breaking it. And when they see those images, it's makes a little more sense. You can talk about the cells in the body all day long, but until you start to see them and see what's happening to them, it's just a cartoon image in your head, effectively. So that was the idea, and that's what we're in the process of trying to get as many modes of destruction as possible. Well, some of the variables we first started to look at, it was kind of on a dare more than anything. I had invented a knot. Well, I was sitting around practicing my knots, waiting for an airport, the airplane, something. And so I developed this knot and couldn't find it anywhere. And I was teased so much by all my working colleagues that I said, fine, we're going to see how strong it is, if it is, because I don't want you to use it. I don't want my name associated with it if it's actually not that suitable. So we came in and we started testing the Slaven knot against other knots, and it did reasonably well. And so knots is one way. We check out the knots, different types of knots. We look at the angles, such as going over a piece of angle iron and how that kind of breaks the outside or crushes the inside. We've done a lot of sand sampling, where we tumble it in a composter with sand or gravel, and we try to get those tiny particles ingrained in the rope, and they end up working like knives. We also have a UV tester, so we can test on the fiber level. We can start to see at what point that weakens each fiber. But mostly it's just whatever treatment we've given, afterwards we pull it and break it and compare it to either the published minimum breaking strength, or we pull a baseline off of that same spool of rope and say here's where it should have broken, given the same other conditions. Well, yeah, the guillotine is one of our first iterations of a destructive mechanism, and we can use it now for a drop test, so where we can take whatever application we have, put it on the line, and then lift up 100, 150 pounds and drop it from whatever height we determine, and without destroying the building in the process. But primarily, when we first started, we pulled a rope over it. I used a come along like you would pull a fence or a boat with, and went to failure, and our dynamometer told us what it was. And so we were sitting around thinking, we need to come up with a better way. This is going to be less work for us because we're getting tired. Smacked too many fingers along the way. So we said, maybe we can get a device that will actually do a cycle, because ropes aren't used once and then thrown away. They're used over and over and over. So if we can begin to examine the fatigue, what's happening with that, we can save our fingers and maybe get better data. So we sat down with a team of students who like breaking things, and I said, well, what do we need to do? Here are my criteria. I want it to pull this much. I want this many cycles per hour. I want. That's what they heard. And so they sat down and they came up with a design and built we break it into three components: the skeleton, the guts, and the brain. And they designed each one, broke off into teams, and have since made a device that all we're doing now is debugging it for the most part. And we can pull ropes and go till failure. I teach safety and machine design. Those are two of the three classes I teach. And so I can bring either class down here and look at it and see what we have. It's nice to take this same concept that we proposed to the students initially and say, how would you guys do it? And some of them have very great ideas. And just giving that set of, here's my list, and go from there. And then they can come down and see how it is and how it works. And so in a lot of ways it enhances the classroom. And same with the safety aspect. I can throw rigging into the class, I can throw life safety ropes, harnesses, and then I can bring it down to this lab and we can experience it instead of just talking about it with their PowerPoints. And since a lot of it was student design, student driven, they're doing presentations on it. We have a research symposium in our college. A student was just at Butler University doing a presentation there. We have a conference in Pittsburgh this fall, and so they take their experiment and they disseminate it through their presentations, and hopefully they'll write a few publications out of it. But that's where the students go. I work with the National Association of Tower Erectors, and I do some training with them, some rigging training, and I include the results in there, and the pictures really strike home to some of the tower hands that are in the class. The sound of something breaking is, and knowing I'm not in trouble, is kind of nice. But when I was an undergrad, one of my jobs was building and breaking furniture, and so I worked for a gentleman and just broke furniture every week. Build more, break it. Yeah, it's nice to actually get up and do something. You have to be pretty kinesthetic, I think, to do this. And so getting up and moving around, and maybe it's avoiding my email that I like. I don't know. Yeah, although things are done a lot with computer simulation, it is, in a sense, basic research, because we're trying to develop the test or the method for doing it, in fact, in some cases. And so a computer can't necessarily quantify how much sand you've put into it. And it can't can't really say how it's reacted until somebody gives it that information. Even then, there's I imagine a lot of variance that goes into it, but until the information's known, it's difficult to say this is how it works. So trying to figure that out it's actually a lot of fun. I was in my yard playing with the kids, and we put rubber bands around a watermelon to try to get enough of them on there to make the watermelon explode. So a few days later, I go to clean up the rubber bands in the yard, and they're breaking real easy. I thought, maybe since these fail so quickly, just being in the sun, maybe we could use something to indicate how fast something is degrading by using something else that we know at a particular rate it degrades. So I talked with a few guys here, both students and faculty. I said, here's my idea. I know we can use something. And since we had the digital print lab and our UV chamber, I thought, why not use ink? Right now it's just a concept we're testing, so we're doing different concentrations of pigments that are known to fade, and put that in the clear ink base we have. And then the idea is to expose that to a certain point and figure out what that relationship is between accumulated UV radiation and when it fades. And then the second part of that is taking these fibers we have from the rope manufacturers, and we expose that to UV as well, and we try to find where that intersects, where you get a significant degradation in the strength and where that tag or that ink begins to fade. So behind that ink you could have something that says danger or do not use. The current test for that on a safety harness is they call it the thumbnail test. Even when you read the manufacturer's directions, it says scrape it with your thumbnail. If it turns to powder, don't use it. And I understand the mechanics behind the fibers in there and how they overlap each other, and it maybe is just the outside, but if you're turning your harness into powder, immediately I become uncomfortable with it. So currently it's a proof of concept we're trying to work on. Each rope, each device, each sling would have to have its own formulation of that. So we'll see how it goes. Well, I think anytime somebody is going to come here, get a bachelor's degree, get a job, and go out, I can at least say for certain with applied engineering, they're hired problem solvers in the long run. So doing research, and most of mine focuses on working with undergrad, is learning a process of thinking and solving that problem. So going from the question to looking at the background and actually testing something and then interpreting that, it goes a long way to help them in their career and help them understand I can't just start guessing and see what happens. So teaching that process, I think, is, for me, maybe it's two birds with one stone, but or maybe it was because I was raised by a science teacher. But going through that process, learning it, I think, I know in my experience in industry, working in production, it helped me a lot. Being able to sit down and organize the train of thought and isolate the issues.
My mom used to read me this book. It's called Black Like Me. It's by this guy named John Howard Griffith. He was a white man in the 50s, early 60s, and he dyed his skin black and went to live down south. It was some type of a tanning booth. It's been decades since I read the book. But that was, she had me read that when I was maybe in third grade. It was right after we read Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. And, you know, our nightly reading, she'd read a paragraph or a page, I'd read a paragraph or a page, and I was just always into the history topics. And those were 2 or 3 of the books. Roots, things like that, the book Roots, that I probably read that as much as I've read any book. But for whatever reason, I always loved history, and I always loved teaching social studies. The idea was something that I was very serious about. I'd always kind of considered it in middle school and high school, and then I got to college, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to go into teaching or law, you know, make money or make a difference, kind of thing. So I got my undergrad in history, and then as I was nearing the end of my undergrad, I scheduled appointments to meet with a social studies professor and with a law professor. And after meeting with the social studies professor, I was pretty much hooked. I taught in the public schools for 10 years, for the most part in 7th grade. My last 8 years were all in 7th grade, ancient cultures, things like that. But I've always loved social studies. But it's one of those courses, I mean, we see it in the media with Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you know, about the Smoot-Hartley Tariff Act, or all just boring memorization, or, you know, write down these 3 most important things about this president, and the kids are all thinking, he was a president? Who is this? Where it's, I mean, it's memorization and regurgitation on the tests. It's taught very poorly. And if you think about it, it's sad. In math, a 2nd grader or a 7th grader, they're analyzing math problems, trying to figure out a solution, just like mathematicians. In science class, they perform experiments like a scientist. You know, whether they're kindergartners playing the game sink or float, or whether they're shooting rockets off from the top of a school, they're still doing things like a scientist. But in social studies, they're doing nothing like a historian. They're not analyzing texts or uncovering things like an archaeologist. They're memorizing and reading textbooks, you know, and that's how social studies is typically taught. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, for the most part, all of the social studies research was on high school students, AP exams, things like that really drove the social studies to be a very secondary-oriented discipline. But with Common Core and PARC, with the changes in the state and national initiatives, there's a real push to infuse historical thinking and history-based topics in the elementary schools. The idea of being like a detective, that's historical thinking. So whatever book you have, there's going to be a problem with it because it's one narrative. If we were to listen to Bush tell the story of the Iraq War, it'd be very different than Gore. And that's the thing, it's one perspective. You have to look at multiple texts. So it comes down to, are you going to use a textbook or lots of trade books or different primary sources? And textbooks have been analyzed thoroughly by lots of other scholars before me. One of the things that I look at specifically is the trade books. With the trade books, you can differentiate. So you can have one book for some of the strongest students and one book for some of the struggling students, and they can be different, but they can all be on the same topic. So everybody's challenged in age-appropriate ways. And I examine what's in the book and what's not in the book. It's not as simple as like just the words that are used, but the words matter, like Columbus discovered or Hitler brainwashed. I mean, those are in books very frequently, and they're absolutely not true. It's not just fact-checking, though. It's how it was included. What if you're teaching 4th graders or 5th graders, or in Lauren's case, 6th graders? You're teaching these 6th graders about the Civil Rights Movement, and the books you're using don't mention anything about the origin of segregation. To a typical 10 or 11-year-old in Lauren's class, they're left with this idea of people resisting segregation. And it's like people wanting to change something, but how did that something start? If the book doesn't mention that this was something that originated and was maintained by white society and the people benefited, there was a large group of people that benefited from pushing this other group of people down, then it kind of, to a 10 or 11-year-old who doesn't have a lot of prior knowledge, it probably seems like, well, this was just the way it was, like the weather, or like, why do we drive on the right side of the street, or why are there 4 bases in baseball, but it wasn't just was. It was a situation that was started and maintained by a group of people. I look at which books or primary source documents, like letters and speeches, newspaper articles. I look at the different texts that engage the students, and then the different tasks, the different methods or assessments that make the students want to analyze the task. What I try to do is I find 2 or 3 books that are rich, that are engaging, or they have wonderful pictures, or the author has great prose, where it just really engages students in the writing style. I try to and I try to take 2 or 3 books on 2 or 3 different topics, or like say with Lauren Covington's in 6th grade at Jefferson here, she has one on Martin Luther King, one on Malcolm X, one on Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, and one on Claudette Colvin. So there's a couple frequently talked about people like Martin and Rosa, and then some infrequently talked about people like Claudette and Martin. And it's interesting, you know, and the kids go through and they read these different books. There's lots of areas of overlap, but there's also lots of areas where they should overlap but don't. And then you've got different primary sources that can kind of connect the dots, fill the gaps, so to speak, whether it's different speeches or letters. And these are free and available in the Library of Congress. The easy part is analyzing the books and comparing, okay, this is what historians know, and this is what the authors of trade books report. You know, kind of like a Venn diagram, seeing what's there, what's not, and how it's there. The easy part is also finding different documents that you can modify or that you can shorten for 6th graders or 3rd graders. The challenge or the exciting part is finding new topics that need to be analyzed or evaluated. Confusion is a powerful, powerful resource for teachers and any researchers. You know, think about what they're doing in the biology building or the chemistry building. All of their research is because of confusion, because they don't know all the answers to this. So the idea of if you give students all the answers, all they have to do is memorize. But if you give students situations where there's multiple answers or there's no clear answer, they're confused. And people, students especially, they want to be unconfused. You know, and it's a powerful motivator. And when you give them an age-appropriate textbook or an age-appropriate trade book and 2 or 3 primary sources that talk about some things that aren't in the book. You know, the book, start to finish, it seems like it's going to include everything. But you include a speech or a letter or a newspaper account that says something's different. If a book on the civil rights movement ends with Martin Luther King's dream, you know, in August of 1963, and then you've got another book that talks about the church bombing 3 weeks later, in which 4 little girls were killed, it doesn't leave the story, you know, the story ends optimistically in typical Martin books with his dream. But you include more, you include different sources, and immediately the kids want to, you know, they want to know, how come this book didn't include this? The best ways to match the texts and the tasks are the ones that lead students to be able to uncover stuff, but not all the answers, to ask the questions. You know, it's a motivating factor. It's the difference between being actively involved or passively involved. Can you imagine a class of kindergartners where the teacher's like, watch me assemble this Lego set. You all sit there and listen to me as I talk about how I assembled this. Oh, those 5-year-olds would be bouncing out of their chairs, wanting to do something. Kids want to do. They don't just want to stare at art, they want to make art. They might look at a pretty picture and be like, that's cool, but they want to do something. And in Lauren's class, she's getting the kids actively involved, where they're analyzing the speeches and piecing together the newspaper accounts, and they're making connections between this document and this book and this document and what's not in this book. I mean, they're actively involved. It's the difference between hearing somebody rattle on about their art and doing the art. You know, people like to be actively involved. And especially with the students, it's incredibly motivating. And when you can differentiate the content so that you've got, say, a lengthy speech and you've got a short newspaper article, you can adjust this. You know, you can adjust these for the different students and their abilities so that kids are all challenged at an appropriate level, covering similar topics. And the idea of everybody's challenged in their own way. In the classroom with Lauren, I mean, these kids are actively participating in the historical reconstruction, of an era. And the students love it. The teacher is kind of like the lead excavator, and they're all digging looking for dinosaur bones. That's from my experience and from talking with local teachers who implement this. I've seen it work in kindergarten and 2nd grade and absolutely in the middle school. It probably works more powerfully in the middle school because the kids, they're not in the pleaser stage. You know what I mean? They don't hug their teacher when they walk into class. They show up to school on the first day thinking they're too cool for this. You know, the older they get, the more apathetic they get, the more they want to be challenged, the more that they want to be engaged. You know, the more you see apathy, the more likely they are to get involved. The fun part is when you get a new topic, you get a new topic. And that's one of the nice things about this research. Not only do I get to inform local teachers who are maybe graduate students or former undergrad students, and not only can I say like, hey, if you buy the books, I've got a ton of different primary documents that can fit, or I've got a grant, can I buy the books? And then can we do some research projects in your class? But I also get to share the students, these 6th grade students or the 2nd grade students in other places, I get to share their final products, their writing, their timelines they created, their concept maps. I get to share that with my undergrad students, and we get to talk about, okay, what might the teacher have done differently? If this worked in a 2nd grade classroom, what can we do to make this more rigorous for a 5th grade or an 8th grade classroom? You know, and that's the neat part, because the research feeds the local classrooms, but it also provides a rich context for my undergrad students or my graduate students to analyze and be a part of. You know, you're pushing the boundaries of what we know and what we understand. You know, Pluto's not a planet, and Brontosaurus is no more, you know, is no more. He's now a Podosaurus, if I remember right. And there's always something new. And that's the neat part about it. It's, you know, I'm not in a tomb digging in ancient Egypt, and I'm not at some excavation site in Brazil looking for dinosaur bones, but I am pushing the boundaries of what we know in my discipline. And that's fun. And I like, and the neat part about it, you know, you get to publish in different journals, and you know, I get to send a nice email to my mom or show Molly my you know, the most recent publication. But the neat part really is when you see it happen in practice, where it's like, okay, this is what I learned about Rosa Parks, and can I purchase books for your classroom from this grant to see how 11-year-olds respond to this material? You know, that's the neat part, when you can see it having an impact on others.
When you're in architecture, architecture is really about people, because the buildings are for people. And I was always much more interested in the people than I was in the buildings, to tell you the truth. And I realized that I could be interested in people my entire life. I wasn't sure that I could be interested in buildings for the same length of time. And I started taking classes kind of casually about psychology. And I was encouraged by people. They thought that I had a real kind of, that I understood psychology kind of intuitively. And I was encouraged by a few people to go on to graduate school. And that's what I did. I applied for a PhD program, and I went to the University of Iowa. Well, for a while, I was in research. Purely research. And then my mother got ill, so I had to kind of go home. And then I started teaching as an adjunct on the side. So I thought one way of combining research and teaching was to find a job doing that. I've always looked at research as sort of a kind of, I'm a detective, and I'm trying to find out the answer to a question. And so I liked kind of pursuing the question until I could find an answer. Or I found out, and usually you find things out, either you verify what you thought, or even more interestingly, it's totally different than what you thought. And as long as you are, you know, accepting of that ambiguity, you have a lot of fun doing it. So it was always fun for me. But I've always been very interested in mental health problems that took place in medical settings, because the truth is that probably about 60% of people, they go to their primary care provider. They don't go to their psychiatrist or their psychologist or their social workers. And most people, you know, they go to their doctor. And so I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder why they do that, and what kinds of people do that. So that's what I pursued. But it's really linked to my mom again, because my mom was a public health nurse, and she was a real advocate of people who had mental health problems. And because she was in public health, she didn't work in a hospital. She worked in a non-traditional setting, which is she went out to people and actually helped them in their homes. That was what that was all about. And so for me, I really wanted to combine my interest in mental health problems that are in medical settings with kind of bringing things to people who needed them to the place that they needed them. And that's kind of how we call it IDET, the Internet Delivered Empirically Based Treatment. That's what that stands for. It was a way of bringing kind of mental health services to a medical setting where it would be most needed. About 75% of the counties that the United States government has designated as having a critical shortage of mental health professionals, they're rural counties. And very few PhD level, like psychologists are there. Very few psychiatrists are in mental health settings. And even if there are community mental health services available, they're usually in the larger towns. They're not in, the teeny-weeny towns that are outside of them. So poverty is an issue too in rural areas. And it's difficult for people to get the money, to get the gas, to go to, faraway places to get mental health settings. What's really not unique is stigma. And most people don't want to go to a place that's been identified as giving mental health services. There's still a lot of embarrassment about it. So going to your primary care provider, they just say, I'm going to the doctors, and a lot of the stigma is removed. Depression goes in cycles. People have 4 to 7 on average bouts of major depression in their life usually. And if someone is not treated and has one major depressive episode, their chances are about 50% that they're going to have a second major depressive episode. If it's untreated after the second episode, there's about a 75% chance that they'll have a third episode. And after the third episode, there's about a 95% chance that they'll have a fourth episode. So many of the mental health problems that we're concerned with, they're chronic. They may ebb and flow, but they may also come back. So that's what happens when mental health problems aren't treated. I was working with a friend of mine at Rosalind Franklin University, and we were working on something very similar at his university, and it is in Lake County, a lot of which is rural. And we were using a new kind of therapy that would treat much broader kinds of mental health problems than had previously been thought possible. And we thought, God, this is perfect for primary care. And so we started working on it. Well, he couldn't get the funding from his end. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to train master's level clinicians in both of our institutions and give them exposure to sort of rural mental health. And so he couldn't get funding, and Bob Chestnut said, Susan, start making friends with people here. Maybe you could get funding here. And he introduced me to people at Sarah Bush, and I went out and talked to them. I met Roger Ostoff, who's head of physician services, and also a lot of the mental health sorts of delivery at Sarah Bush. And he was very interested in it. He said, would you come and present to our board behavioral health group? And I did. And they were uniformly positive about it. And Roger and I have been working on this for about 2 years. So it was a long process, and it wasn't always easy. But now we have a clinic that we're working out of. And so it's kind of coming to fruition now. One of the big issues that I was not aware of that they really helped me with, and it's both CATS and ITS that have been very helpful. They said, look, the only way we can make this secure is with a cable connection. It can't go out by Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi can be hacked into very, very easily. So we decided, okay, then it has to be through cable. It can't be through Wi-Fi. And they've been working with Sarah Bush Lincoln, and Sarah Bush Lincoln has very high standards for security. And it takes somebody who's really dedicated, because it's been not easy, I know sometimes, for the ITS people to help us to kind of solve the problems that we needed to. But by using cable, we've got a level of security. We've got security software. So we feel pretty good about that we're meeting the federal regulations for privacy that we have to meet. The idea is that if people can't come to the services come to them. And so what we decided to do was to go where most people have mental health problems and to use Skype to deliver psychotherapy from EIU to the smaller clinics that Sarah Bush Lincoln has set up. This is kind of a pilot program, and it's good for mental health, it's good for the community, and it's good for our students to have experience doing this, because what they found is the more experience that students have with it, the more likely they are to stay in like rural communities. And patients are just as satisfied and seem to respond just as well to telemental health as they do to somebody being in the room. I think it's the act of talking and responding that's really the important thing. And they know that you're a person, you know, they know that there's a person on the other end of that. I don't think you have to be in the room, but I do think that you have to have a presence. And that's what Skype is, it's a presence. The person who's working with me now is just one student, and I'm paying her stipend so that she can work exclusively with me. And her name is Dodie Jennings. And I'm teaching Dodie this kinds of therapy, and then I tape her sessions so that I can listen to them and go back over them with her. So she's going to be the primary therapist for as long as we can make it that way. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and as a licensed clinical psychologist, I'm allowed to supervise people. And because it's a certain kind of therapy that we have, I also have to kind of check to make sure, you know, that she's doing it right. And that's what this is. It's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea behind it is that the way you think is going to affect how you feel emotionally. And it works. I mean, it works very, very well, we found. And so we teach it as sort of the cornerstone of the kind of therapy that they need to learn once they get out of our program. Well, the grant that I got was not just for the Skype sessions, but it was also for training students. And I couldn't do it on a really big scale, but I hope that I can get funding to do it on a large scale. And I hope that we can get more students involved and that there will be more clinics that will be involved. This is just sort of to see how it works, but it seems to be working so far. I mean, it's possible, we're implementing it. So what I'd like it to be is, I'd like to kind of see if we could get our program to have, I don't think there's another master's level rural mental health program in the United States. They're almost all PhD levels. But the people with the master's degrees are who are really gonna stick around here. And so I hope that we can give them that exposure. You know what? Our students are always asking for hands-on experience. And I think this is a great way of giving them a hands-on experience. Because when you're in mental health, probably your most nerve-wracking moment is when you give your first therapy session. What are they gonna talk about? You know, what am I gonna talk about? What am I gonna do with them? If you have kind of a little exposure at first, it makes you a whole lot more comfortable. I guess the main reason I'm doing it, though, is because they've shown that if you have internships where you go out and you do, you know, mental health treatments with people in rural settings, you're more likely to stay there, or to at least seek employment in similar settings. You know, to me, research is progress. And a lot of times, people think they know the answers to things, and they act like they know the answers to things, but it may be totally wrong. And I think research is one way to kind of challenge, you know, is what we know, do we really know it? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really different. So if you can make that kind of progress, you know, taking what are common beliefs, testing them and then saying, hey, that's true, or no, that isn't true, then you're making progress. Because if it's not true, you don't want to keep doing that, you know. I think that if you aren't active, you're not going to have the enthusiasm for actually doing hands-on research. And I just think that you model what you speak, you know, and if you can model what good research is, the ethics behind it, the idea, the clarity of the idea that you have to have, it's much easier for somebody to say, oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do. So I think you have to both do it and also model it and get people involved in it. For me, it's just really exciting. You know, I don't always know the answer to the questions that I'm asking. And so whether or not, you know, what I thought I was going to come up with actually came up with, it doesn't matter to me. It's always like, hey, that's great. That's really interesting. Now I've got some numbers to back this up. I think what most people don't like, though, is what I said before, the ambiguity, not knowing if it's going to turn out as you predicted it. But for me, whether or not it turns out the way you predicted it isn't the point. It's the point of doing it and either proving or disproving yourself.
My parents are both musicians. My mom is a classical soprano, and my dad, who's sort of a jack of all trades, he's a composer, he was a music teacher, he plays guitar, he plays piano, but he also played drums for quite a long time. His drums being around the house when we were kids, my brother started playing them a little bit, and at a very young age, about 5, I started playing drums as well. I don't know when I played my first performance. It was probably in grade school band or something. And my first performance of my own volition was with my garage band in 7th grade. The teaching part of my life has probably come with maturity. Probably since I finished college, I knew that that was part of my day, that I at least wanted that as a little part of my day. And as I got older, I realized that that needs to be a good part of my existence, is training the next generations of musicians. Giving each student your full attention and helping them through every one of their musical and otherwise struggles is it's incredibly exhausting. You think it'd be so much easier just to play the drums today, but that's, I think, why I like it. There's a struggle in both, and there's a reward in both. So it's like one less note here. Most important thing as a creative musician is to be inquisitive and not to wait for an answer, but to go figure out an answer or a solution to a musical issue that you're struggling with. It's not always on the page, and it's not always found on the internet, you know. Sometimes the solution is years of gathering information and then making a good decision about how am I going to play this instrument creatively, or how am I going to play this piece of music interestingly. Most of my creative activity is in the form of playing concerts, making recordings, which those two things, the production of a recording itself, when it actually appears as a CD, a piece of vinyl, a download, that is the tip of the iceberg. The presentation of a concert is just the surface of what you see. There are hours and weeks and years of rehearsals that go into those. Not just the rehearsals for a particular concert, but and the individual practicing for a particular performance, but just I don't even want to know how many hours it is added up in my life. My brother and I, like I said, he and I have sort of the same job, actually. Our main job, we teach percussion at a university, and we play percussion professionally. And we also play in a group together called the Africa West Percussion Trio, which is sort of a amalgam of contemporary chamber music and music that we write that's based on our experience with African diasporic music. Music from West Africa, Central Africa, Afro-Brazil, Afro-Cuba, places like that. That group, Africa West, is what's called an ensemble in resonance at Baldwin Wallace University, where my brother is the percussion teacher. That essentially means that we are employed there part-time to rehearse and perform our own music, to be a vehicle for all the students there to see something creative develop. And as part of our percussion training, we played in a West African and Afro-Brazilian drumming group. And it was eye-opening when we first started it. Like when I was a freshman, when the other two guys were freshmen in college and had never done such a thing before. It was sort of revelatory and completely confusing, but musically, but so invigorating. So we, at that time, we individually set out, and very soon thereafter, the group was founded in 1999, we set out to master those, or get as close to it as we could, master those musics that had been affected by the African slave trade, even though where we come from is somewhat distant from those traditions. It's just that we loved those musics so much. Music from Ghana, Benin, Togo, Nigeria, music from Brazil, music from Cuba, and frankly, the very present and very rigorous kind of music that was brought here and developed here as a result of African slavery. We just love it. The distance could make it difficult, but because of our pretty rigorous rehearsals when we are together, because of the recordings we make, and simply because we're really dedicated to doing it, we make it work despite the distance. And when we are together, we'll rehearse 6, 7, 8, as many as 10 hours a day, which play drums 10 hours a day, that starts to hurt after a while. It's joyous, but my hands are swollen at the end of the day, you know. My ears are ringing, even with earplugs, and my brain is exhausted. The way we remember all our music, because none of it is written down, because it wouldn't really work to write that music down, is we rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, and we record our rehearsals and go off on our own and practice individually with those recordings, and then when we come back, we put those pieces together and just play and play and play until it sort of becomes part of us. So we have probably 2 more records worth of music unrecorded yet. I always think it's interesting when somebody looks at your schedule on your office door, and there might be a fair amount of holes in the schedule. Those hours are quickly filled with practicing, researching pieces, researching styles of music, and as juvenile as it may sound, just simply watching videos and listening to recordings of musicians is a huge part of our process. And I don't mean watching them or listening to them while we're doing the dishes, while we're mowing the lawn, though I certainly do those things. But really sitting down with a pair of headphones and digging into a score with a recording, sitting at the drum set and transcribing things that earlier drummers have played. These are all very time-consuming, rigorous mentally exhausting things, they're super rewarding. And I mean, there's hardly anything more joyous for me than getting to sit down at my drum set, playing a set of congas, playing the marimba. Any of these things are, when I get to do those, as taxing as they are, it feels like play. It doesn't really feel like work. Right, left, right. If a musician is not creatively active, whether it's performing or composing or recording or even thinking about how their teaching is impactful musically, any and all of those situations, then I don't know that they do their students a great service. So it's always what we want to do on their behalf as well as selfishly on our own. I have so many things musically that I want to do in my life that I don't think I'll ever get them done. And one way I think that can help these students here or anywhere that we run into them is that they see that it's not a quest that ends when you receive a degree. It's one that continues your entire life, even beyond retirement. Some of my favorite mentors retire from performing or retire from teaching and continue composing up until the day they drop, you know? So that part of them is always fed. That part of them is always searching for satisfaction. I love to play. So even playing with young students, and these are, well, they're 18 to 24 years old, anywhere in there, and they may be growing into adults, but in some ways they're still learning maturity as musicians. So it's sort of fun to be hands-on as part of that process. And yes, it can be sort of scary, how is this going to come together? But it is also very rewarding every single time when it does come together. And pretty much all the time it does come together. When you lead a group sort of from the inside like that, not on sort of the exterior, just as a coach, I think you sort of get to know your students playing and their habits and tendencies even closer. You also get to know where your weaknesses are. The sort of Afrocentric music that we play is all taught by rote. They might get sheets of lyrics that we sing traditional religious or even secular songs, but they don't have any rhythms or melodies or anything written down. I record them for them or send them recordings of those things, and then they learn them on their own, or they learn them directly from me as I have learned them for decades. And then that becomes a great challenge of making fairly foreign music to them sound natural, sound, to use this word, authentic. We're not only trying to teach them how to play their instrument, how to make a nice musical phrase, how to prepare for the musical life as a teacher, as a performer, as whatever, but that you're also teaching them that it's not just what you're given as a student, it's how you see that even teachers or supposed masters of music making are continually going out and trying to find whatever it is they're after. I hope that students become aware that it doesn't ever stop, that thirst.